This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the North American Review, November 16, 1906, Chapters from My Autobiography, by Mark Twain, Chapter 6. From Susie's Biography. Papa made arrangements to read at Vassar College the 1st of May, and I went with him. We went by way of New York City. Mama went with us to New York and stayed 2 days to do some shopping. We started Tuesday at 2:30 in the afternoon. We reached New York about 6:15. Papa went right up to General Grant's from the station, and Mama and I went to the Everett House. Aunt Clara came to supper with us up in our room. We and Aunt Clara were going to the theater right after supper, and we expected Papa to take us there and to come home as early as he could. But we got through dinner, and he didn't come, and Mama got more perplexed and worried. But at last we thought we would have to go without him. So we put on our things and started downstairs, but before we'd gotten half down we met Papa coming up with a great bunch of roses in his hand. He explained that the reason he was so late was that his watch stopped and he didn't notice, and kept thinking it an hour earlier than it really was. The roses he carried were some Colonel Fred Grant sent to Mama. We went to the theater and enjoyed Adonis, word illegible, acted very much. We reached home about 11 o'clock and went right to bed. Wednesday morning we got up rather late and had breakfast about 9 o'clock. After breakfast, Mama went out shopping, and Papa and I went to see Papa's agent about some business matters. After Papa had gotten through talking to Cousin Charlie Webster, Papa's agent, we went to get a friend of Papa's, Major Pond, to go and see a dog show with us. Then we went to see the dogs with Major Pond, and we had a delightful time seeing so many dogs together. When we got through seeing the dogs, Papa thought he would go and see General Grant, and I went with him. This was April 29, 1885. Papa went up into General Grant's room, and he took me with him. I felt greatly honored and delighted when Papa took me into General Grant's room and let me see the General and Colonel Grant, for General Grant is a man I shall be glad all my life that I have seen. Papa and General Grant had a long talk together, and Papa has written an account of his talk and visit with General Grant for me to put into his biography. Susie has inserted in this place that account of mine as follows. April 29, 1885. I called on General Grant and took Susie with me. The General was looking and feeling far better than he had looked or felt for some months. He had ventured to work again on his book that morning, the first time he had done any work for perhaps a month. This morning's work was his first attempt at dictating, and it was a thorough success, to his great delight. He had always said that it would be impossible for him to dictate anything, but I had said that he was noted for clearness of statement, and as a narrative was simply a statement of consecutive facts, he was consequently peculiarly qualified and equipped for dictation. This turned out to be true, for he had dictated 2 hours that morning to a shorthand writer, had never hesitated for words, had not repeated himself, and the manuscript, when finished, needed no revision. The 2 hours' work was an account of Appomattox, and this was such an extremely important feature that his book would necessarily have been severely lame without it. Therefore I had taken a shorthand writer there before to see if I could not get him to write at least a few lines about Appomattox. Note, I was his publisher. I was putting his personal memoirs to press at the time. S.L.C. But he was at that time not well enough to undertake it. I was aware that of all the 100 versions of Appomattox, not one was really correct. Therefore I was extremely anxious that he should leave behind him the truth. His throat was not distressing him, and his voice was much better and stronger than usual. He was so delighted to have gotten Appomattox accomplished once more in his life, to have gotten the matter off his mind, that he was as talkative as his old self. He received Susie very pleasantly, and then fell to talking about certain matters which he hoped to be able to dictate next day, and he said in substance that, among other things, he wanted to settle, once for all, a question that had been bandied about from mouth to mouth and from newspaper to newspaper. That question was, with whom originated the idea of the march to the sea? Was it Grant's or was it Sherman's idea? Whether I or someone else, being anxious to get the important fact settled, asked him with whom the idea originated, I don't remember. But I remember his answer. I shall always remember his answer. General Grant said, "Neither of us originated the idea of Sherman's march to the sea. The enemy did it." He went on to say that the enemy, however, necessarily originated a great many of the plans that the general on the opposite side gets the credit for. At the same time that the enemy is doing that, he is laying open other moves which the opposing general sees and takes advantage of. In this case, Sherman had a plan all thought out, of course. He meant to destroy the 2 remaining railroads in that part of the country, and that would finish up that region. But General Hood did not play the military part that he was expected to play. On the contrary, General Hood made a dive at Chattanooga. This left the march to the sea open to Sherman, and so, after sending part of his army to defend and hold what he had acquired in the Chattanooga region, he was perfectly free to proceed with the rest of it through Georgia. He saw the opportunity, and he would not have been fit for his place if he had not seized it. He wrote me, the general is speaking now, what his plan was, and I sent him word to go ahead. My staff were opposed to the movement. I think the general said they tried to persuade him to stop Sherman. The chief of his staff, the general said, even went so far as to go to Washington without the general's knowledge and get the ear of the authorities, and he succeeded in arousing their fears to such an extent that they telegraphed General Grant to stop Sherman. Then General Grant said, "Out of deference to the government, I telegraphed Sherman and stopped him 24 hours. And then, considering that that was deference enough to the government, I telegraphed him to go ahead again." I have not tried to give the general's language, but only the general idea of what he said. The thing that mainly struck me was his terse remark that the enemy originated the idea of the march to the sea. It struck me because it was so suggestive of the general's epigrammic fashion, saying a great deal in a single crisp sentence. This is my account, and signed Mark Twain. Susie resumes. After Papa and General Grant had had their talk, we went back to the hotel where Mama was, and Papa told Mama all about his interview with General Grant. Mama and I had a nice quiet afternoon together. That pair of devoted comrades were always shutting themselves up together when there was opportunity to have what Susie called a cozy time. From Susie's nursery days to the end of her life, she and her mother were close friends, intimate friends, passionate adorers of each other. Susie's was a beautiful mind, and it made her an interesting comrade, and with a fine mind she had a heart like her mother's. Susie never had an interest or an occupation which she was not glad to put aside for that something which was in all cases more precious to her, a visit with her mother. Susie died at the right time, the fortunate time of life, the happy age, 24 years. At 24, such a girl has seen the best of life, life as a happy dream. After that age the risks begin, responsibility comes, and with it the cares, the sorrows, and the inevitable tragedy. For her mother's sake I would have brought her back from the grave if I could, but I would not have done it for my own. From Susie's biography. Then Papa went to read in public. There were a great many authors that read, that Thursday afternoon, beside Papa. I would have liked to have gone and heard Papa read, but Papa said he was going to read in Vassar, just what he was planning to read in New York, so I stayed at home with Mama. The next day Mama planned to take the 4 o'clock car back to Hartford. We rose quite early that morning and went to the Vienna bakery and took breakfast there. From there we went to a German bookstore and bought some German books for Clara's birthday. Dear me, the power of association to snatch moldy dead memories out of their graves and make them walk. That remark about buying foreign books throws a sudden white glare upon the distant past, and I see the long stretch of a New York street with an unearthly vividness, and John Hay walking down it, grave and remorseful. I was walking down it, too, that morning, and I overtook Hay and asked him what the trouble was. He turned a lusterless eye upon me and said, "My case is beyond cure. In the most innocent way in the world I have committed a crime which will never be forgiven by the sufferers, for they will never believe." Oh, well, no, I was going to say they would never believe that I did the thing innocently. The truth is, They will know that I acted innocently, because they are rational people. But what of that? I never can look them in the face again, nor they me, perhaps. Hay was a young bachelor, and at that time was on the Tribune staff. He explained his trouble in these words, substantially: "When I was passing along here yesterday morning on my way downtown to the office, I stepped into a bookstore where I am acquainted, and asked if they had anything new from the other side. They handed me a French novel in the usual yellow paper cover, and I carried it away. I didn't even look at the title of it. It was for recreation reading, and I was on my way to work. I went mooning and dreaming along, and I think I hadn't gone more than 50 yards when I heard my name called. I stopped, and a private carriage drew up at the sidewalk, and I shook hands with the inmates, mother and young daughter, excellent people. They were on their way to the steamer to sail for Paris. The mother said, 'I saw that book in your hand, and I judged by the look of it that it was a French novel. Is it?' I said it was. She said, 'Do let me have it, so that my daughter can practice her French on it on the way over.' Of course I handed her the book, and we parted. 10 minutes ago I was passing that bookstore again, and I stepped in and fetched away another copy of that book. And here it is. Read the first page of it. That is enough. You will know what the rest is like. I think it must be the foulest book in the French language, one of the foulest, anyway. I would be ashamed to offer it to a harlot, but, oh dear, I gave it to that sweet young girl without shame. Take my advice. Don't give away a book until you have examined it." From Susy's biography: "Then Mama and I went to do some shopping, and Papa went to see General Grant. After we had finished doing our shopping, we went home to the hotel together. When we entered our room in the hotel, we saw on the table a vase full of exquisite red roses. Mama, who is very fond of flowers, exclaimed, 'Oh, I wonder who could have sent them.' We both looked at the card in the midst of the roses, and saw that it was written on in Papa's handwriting. It was written in German, 'Liebes Geschenk an die Mama.' I am sure I didn't say 'on.' That is Susy's spelling, not mine. Also, I am sure I didn't spell Geschenkt so liberally as all that. S.L.C. Mama was delighted. Papa came home and gave Mama her ticket, and after visiting a while with her went to see Major Pond, and Mama and I sat down to our lunch. After lunch most of our time was taken up with packing, and at about 3 o'clock we went to escort Mama to the train. We got on board the train with her and stayed with her about 5 minutes, and then we said good-bye to her, and the train started for Hartford. It was the first time I had ever been away from home without Mama in my life, although I was 13 years old. Papa and I drove back to the hotel and got Major Pond, and then went to see the Brooklyn Bridge. We went across it to Brooklyn on the cars, and then walked back across it from Brooklyn to New York. We enjoyed looking at the beautiful scenery, and we could see the bridge move under the intense heat of the sun. We had a perfectly delightful time, but were pretty tired when we got back to the hotel. The next morning we rose early, took our breakfast, and took an early train to Poughkeepsie. We had a very pleasant journey to Poughkeepsie. The Hudson was magnificent, shrouded with beautiful mist. When we arrived at Poughkeepsie it was raining quite hard, which fact greatly disappointed me, because I very much wanted to see the outside of the buildings of Vassar College, and as it rained that would be impossible. It was quite a long drive from the station to Vassar College, and Papa and I had a nice long time to discuss and laugh over German profanity. One of the German phrases Papa particularly enjoys is, "O heilige Maria, Mutter Jesus." Jean has a German nurse, and this was one of her phrases. There was a time when Jean exclaimed, "Ach Gott!" to every trifle, but when Mama found it out, she was shocked and instantly put a stop to it. It brings that pretty little German girl vividly before me, a sweet and innocent and plump little creature with peachy cheeks, a clear-souled little maiden, and without offense, notwithstanding her profanities, and she was loaded to the eyebrows with them. She was a mere child. She was not 15 yet. She was just from Germany, and knew no English. She was always scattering her profanities around, and they were such a satisfaction to me that I never dreamed of such a thing as modifying her. For my own sake I had no disposition to tell on her. Indeed, I took pains to keep her from being found out. I told her to confine her religious exercises to the children's quarters, and urged her to remember that Mrs. Clemens was prejudiced against pieties on weekdays. To the children, the little maid's profanities sounded natural and proper and right, because they had been used to that kind of talk in Germany, and they attached no evil importance to it. It grieves me that I have forgotten those vigorous remarks. I long hoarded them in my memory as a treasure, but I remember one of them still because I heard it so many times. A trial of that little creature's life was the children's hair. She would tug and strain with her comb, accompanying her work with her misplaced pieties, and when finally she was through with her triple work, she always fired up and exploded her thanks toward the sky, where they belonged, in this form: Gott sei Dank, ich bin fertig mit dem Gott fürs dammernde Haar. I believe I am not quite brave enough to translate it. From Susie's biography. We at length reached Vassar College, and she looked very finely, her buildings and her grounds being very beautiful. We went to the front doors and rang the bell. The young girl who came to the doors wished to know who we wanted to see. Evidently we were not expected. Papa told her who we wanted to see, and she showed us to the parlor. We waited, no one came, and waited, no one came. Still no one came. It was beginning to seem pretty awkward. "Oh, well, this is a pretty piece of business," Papa exclaimed. At length we heard footsteps coming down the long corridor, and Miss C., the lady who had invited Papa, came into the room. She greeted Papa very pleasantly, and they had a nice little chat together. Soon the lady principal also entered, and she was very pleasant and agreeable. She showed us to our rooms, and said she would send for us when dinner was ready. We went into our rooms, but we had nothing to do for half an hour except to watch the raindrops as they fell upon the window panes. At last we were called to dinner, and I went down without Papa, as he never eats anything in the middle of the day. I sat at the table with the lady principal, and enjoyed very much seeing all the young girls trooping into the dining room. After dinner I went around the college with the young ladies, and Papa stayed in his room and smoked. When it was supper time, Papa went down and ate supper with us, and we had a very delightful supper. After supper the young ladies went to their rooms to dress for the evening. Papa went to his room, and I went with the lady principal. At length the guests began to arrive, but Papa still remained in his room until called for. Papa read in the chapel. It was the first time I had ever heard him read in my life, that is, in public. When he came out onto the stage, I remember the people behind me exclaimed, "Oh, how queer he is! Isn't he funny?" I thought Papa was very funny, although I did not think him queer. He read A Trying Situation and The Golden Arm, a ghost story that he heard down south when he was a little boy. The Golden Arm Papa had told me before, but he had startled me so that I did not much wish to hear it again. But I had resolved this time to be prepared and not to let myself be startled, but still Papa did, and very, very much. He startled the whole roomful of people, and they jumped as one man. The other story was also very funny and interesting, and I enjoyed the evening inexpressibly much. After Papa had finished reading, we all went down to the collation in the dining room, and after that there was dancing and singing. Then the guests went away, and Papa and I went to bed. The next morning we rose early, took an early train for Hartford, and reached Hartford at 1:30 We were very glad to get back. How charitably she treats that ghastly experience! It is a dear and lovely disposition, and a most valuable one, that can brush away indignities and discourtesies, and seek and find the pleasanter features of an experience. Susie had that disposition, and it was one of the jewels of her character that had come to her straight from her mother. It is a feature that was left out of me at birth, and at 70 I have not yet acquired it. I did not go to Vassar College professionally, but as a guest and gratis. Aunt Clara, now Mrs. John B. Stanchfield, was a graduate of Vassar, and it was to please her that I inflicted that journey upon Susie and myself. The invitation had come to me from both the lady mentioned by Susie and the president of the college, a sour old saint who has probably been gathered to his fathers long ago, and I hope they enjoy him. I hope they value his society. I think I can get along without it, in either end of the next world. We arrived at the college in that soaking rain, and Susie has described, with just a suggestion of dissatisfaction, the sort of reception we got. Susie had to sit in her damp clothes half an hour while we waited in the parlor. Then she was taken to a fireless room and left to wait there again, as she has stated. I do not remember that president's name, and I am sorry. He did not put in an appearance until it was time for me to step upon the platform in front of that great garden of young and lovely blossoms. He caught up with me and advanced upon the platform with me and was going to introduce me. I said in substance, "You have allowed me to get along without your help thus far, and if you will retire from the platform I will try to do the rest without it." I did not see him any more, but I detest his memory. Of course my resentment did not extend to the students, and so I had an unforgettable good time talking to them. And I think they had a good time too, for they responded "as one man," to use Susy's unimprovable phrase. Girls are charming creatures. I shall have to be twice 70 years old before I change my mind as to that. I am to talk to a crowd of them this afternoon, students of Barnard College, the sex's annex to Columbia University, and I think I shall have as pleasant a time with those lasses as I had with the Vassar girls 21 years ago. From Susy's Biography. I stopped in the middle of Mamma's early history to tell about our trip to Vassar because I was afraid I would forget about it. Now I will go on where I left off. Some time after Miss Emma Nye died, Papa took Mamma and little Langdon to Elmira for the summer. When in Elmira, Langdon began to fail, but I think Mamma did not know just what was the matter with him. I was the cause of the child's illness. His mother trusted him to my care, and I took him a long drive in an open barouche for an airing. It was a raw, cold morning, but he was well wrapped about with furs, and, in the hands of a careful person, no harm would have come to him. But I soon dropped into a reverie and forgot all about my charge. The furs fell away and exposed his bare legs. By and by the coachman noticed this, and I arranged the wraps again, but it was too late. The child was almost frozen. I hurried home with him. I was aghast at what I had done, and I feared the consequences. I have always felt shame for that treacherous morning's work, and have not allowed myself to think of it when I could help it. I doubt if I had the courage to make a confession at that time. I think it most likely that I have never confessed until now. From Susy's Biography. At last it was time for Papa to return to Hartford, and Langdon was real sick at that time, but still Mamma decided to go with him, thinking the journey might do him good. But after they reached Hartford he became very sick, and his trouble proved to be diphtheria. He died about a week after Mamma and Papa reached Hartford. He was buried by the side of Grandpa at Elmira, New York. Susy rests there with them, S.L.C. After that, Mamma became very, very ill, so ill that there seemed great danger of death, but with a great deal of good care she recovered. Some months afterward, Mamma and Papa, and Susy, who was perhaps 14 or 15 months old at the time, S.L.C., went to Europe and stayed for a time in Scotland and England. In Scotland, Mamma and Papa became very well acquainted with Dr. John Brown, the author of Rab and His Friends, and he met, but was not so well acquainted with, Mr. Charles Kingsley, Mr. Henry M. Stanley, Sir Thomas Hardy, grandson of the Captain Hardy to whom Nelson said, "Kiss me, Hardy," when dying on shipboard, Mr. Henry Irving, Robert Browning, Sir Charles Dilke, Mr. Charles Reade, Mr. William Black, Lord Houghton, Frank Buckland, Mr. Tom Hughes, Anthony Trollope, Tom Hood, son of the poet, and Mamma and Papa were quite well acquainted with Dr. MacDonald and family, and Papa met Harrison Ainsworth. I remember all these men very well indeed, except the last one. I do not recall Ainsworth. By my count, Susy mentions 14 men. They are all dead except Sir Charles Dilke. We met a great many other interesting people, among them Lewis Carroll, author of The Immortal Alice, but he was only interesting to look at, for he was the stillest and shyest full-grown man I have ever met except Uncle Remus. Dr. MacDonald and several other lively talkers were present, and the talk went briskly on for a couple of hours, but Carroll sat still all the while except that now and then he answered a question. His answers were brief. I do not remember that he elaborated any of them. At a dinner at Smalley's we met Herbert Spencer. At a large luncheon party at Lord Houghton's we met Sir Arthur Helps, who was a celebrity of worldwide fame at the time, but is quite forgotten now. Lord Elcho, a large vigorous man, sat at some distance down the table. He was talking earnestly about Godalming. It was a deep and flowing and unarticulated rumble, but I got the godalming pretty clearly every time he broke free of the rumble, and as all the strength was on the first end of the word, it startled me every time, because it sounded so like swearing. In the middle of the luncheon Lady Houghton rose, remarked to the guests on her right and on her left in a matter-of-factly way, "Excuse me, I have an engagement," and without further ceremony she went off to meet it. This would have been doubtful etiquette in America. Lord Houghton told a number of delightful stories. He told them in French, and I lost nothing of them but the nubs. Mark Twain, to be continued. End of chapter 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the North American Review, December 7, 1906, chapters from my autobiography by Mark Twain, Chapter 7. I was always heedless. I was born heedless, and therefore I was constantly and quite unconsciously committing breaches of the minor proprieties which brought upon me humiliations which ought to have humiliated me but didn't, because I didn't know anything had happened. But Livy knew, and so the humiliations fell to her share, poor child, who had not earned them and did not deserve them. She always said I was the most difficult child she had. She was very sensitive about me. It distressed her to see me do heedless things which could bring me under criticism, and so she was always watchful and alert to protect me from the kind of transgressions which I have been speaking of. When I was leaving Hartford for Washington, upon the occasion referred to, she said, "I have written a small warning and put it in a pocket of your dress vest. When you are dressing to go to the author's reception at the White House, you will naturally put your fingers in your vest pockets, according to your custom, and you will find that little note there. Read it carefully and do as it tells you. I cannot be with you, and so I delegate my sentry duties to this little note. If I should give you the warning by word of mouth now, it would pass from your head and be forgotten in a few minutes." It was President Cleveland's first term. I had never seen his wife, the young, the beautiful, the good-natured, the sympathetic, the fascinating. Sure enough, just as I had finished dressing to go to the White House, I found that little note, which I had long ago forgotten. It was a grave little note, a serious little note, like its writer, but it made me laugh. Livy's gentle gravities often produced that effect upon me, where the expert humorist's best joke would have failed, for I do not laugh easily. When we reached the White House and I was shaking hands with the President, he started to say something, but I interrupted him and said, "If Your Excellency will excuse me, I will come back in a moment, but now I have a very important matter to attend to, and it must be attended to at once." I turned to Mrs. Cleveland, the young, the beautiful, the fascinating, and gave her my card, on the back of which I had written, "He didn't," and I asked her to sign her name below those words. She said, "He didn't? He didn't what?" "Oh," I said, "never mind. We cannot stop to discuss that now. This is urgent. Won't you please sign your name?" I handed her a fountain pen. "Why," she said, "I cannot commit myself in that way. Who is it that didn't? And what is it that he didn't?" "Oh," I said, "time is flying, flying, flying. Won't you take me out of my distress and sign your name to it? It's all right. I give you my word it's all right." She looked nonplussed, but hesitatingly and mechanically she took the pen and said, "I will sign it. I will take the risk. But you must tell me all about it right afterwards, so that you can be arrested before you get out of the house in case there should be anything criminal about this." Then she signed, and I handed her Mrs. Clemens' note, which was very brief, very simple, and to the point. It said, "Don't wear your arctics in the White House." It made her shout, and at my request she summoned a messenger, and we sent that card at once to the mail on its way to Mrs. Clemens in Hartford. When the little Ruth was about a year or a year and a half old, Mason, an old and valued friend of mine, was consul general at Frankfurt on the Main. I had known him well in 1867, '68, and '69 in America, and I and mine had spent a good deal of time with him and his family in Frankfurt in '78. He was a thoroughly competent, diligent, and conscientious official. Indeed, he possessed these qualities in so large a degree that among American consuls he might fairly be said to be monumental, for at that time our consular service was largely, and I think I may say mainly, in the hands of ignorant, vulgar, and incapable men who had been political healers in America, and had been taken care of by transference to consulates where they could be supported at the government's expense instead of being transferred to the poorhouse, which would have been cheaper and more patriotic. Mason, in '78, had been consul general in Frankfurt for several years, 4, I think. He had come from Marseilles with a great record. He had been consul there during 13 years, and one part of his record was heroic. There had been a desolating cholera epidemic, and Mason was the only representative of any foreign country who stayed at his post and saw it through. And during that time he not only represented his own country, but he represented all the other countries in Christendom, and did their work, and did it well, and was praised for it by them, in words of no uncertain sound. This great record of Mason's had saved him from official decapitation straight along while Republican presidents occupied the chair. But now it was occupied by a Democrat. Mr. Cleveland was not seated in it. He was not yet inaugurated, before he was deluged with applications from Democratic politicians desiring the appointment of 1,000 or so politically useful Democrats to Mason's place. A year or two later Mason wrote me and asked if I couldn't do something to save him from destruction. I was very anxious to keep him in his place, but at first I could not think of any way to help him, for I was a mugwump. We, the Mugwumps, a little company made up of the unenslaved of both parties, the very best men to be found in the two great parties, that was our idea of it, voted 60,000 strong for Mr. Cleveland in New York and elected him. Our principles were high and very definite. We were not a party, we had no candidates, we had no axes to grind. Our vote laid upon the man we cast it for, no obligation of any kind. By our rule we could not ask for office, we could not accept office. When voting, it was our duty to vote for the best man, regardless of his party name. We had no other creed. Vote for the best man, that was creed enough. Such being my situation, I was puzzled to know how to try to help Mason, and at the same time save my mugwump purity undefiled. It was a delicate place. But presently, out of the ruck of confusions in my mind, rose a sane thought, clear and bright, to wit, since it was a mugwump's duty to do his best to put the best man in office, necessarily it must be a mugwump's duty to try to keep the best man in when he was already there. My course was easy now. It might not be quite delicate for a mugwump to approach the President directly, but I could approach him indirectly, with all delicacy, since in that case not even courtesy would require him to take notice of an application which no one could prove had ever reached him. Yes, it was easy and simple sailing now. I could lay the matter before Ruth, in her cradle, and wait for results. I wrote to the little child, and said to her all that I have just been saying about mugwump principles and the limitations which they put upon me. I explained that it would not be proper for me to apply to her father in Mr. Mason's behalf, but I detailed to her Mr. Mason's high and honorable record, and suggested that she take the matter in her own hands, and do a patriotic work which I felt some delicacy about venturing upon myself. I asked her to forget that her father was only President of the United States, and her subject and servant. I asked her not to put her application in the form of a command, but to modify it and give it the fictitious and pleasanter form of a mere request, that it would be no harm to let him gratify himself with the superstition that he was independent and could do as he pleased in the matter. I begged her to put stress, and plenty of it, upon the proposition that to keep Mason in his place would be a benefaction to the nation, to enlarge upon that and keep still about all other considerations. In due time I received a letter from the President, written with his own hand, signed by his own hand, acknowledging Ruth's intervention and thanking me for enabling him to save to the country the services of so good and well-tried a servant as Mason, and thanking me also for the detailed fullness of Mason's record, which could leave no doubt in anyone's mind that Mason was in his right place and ought to be kept there. Mason has remained in the service ever since, and is now Consul General at Paris. During the time that we were living in Buffalo, in '71, Mr. Cleveland was sheriff, but I never happened to make his acquaintance or even see him. In fact, I suppose I was not even aware of his existence. 14 years later he was become the greatest man in the state. I was not living in the state at the time. He was governor, and was about to step into the post of President of the United States. At that time I was on the public highway in company with another bandit, George W. Cable. We were robbing the public with readings from our works during 4 months, and in the course of time we went to Albany to levy tribute, and said, "We ought to go and pay our respects to the governor." So Cable and I went to that majestic Capitol building and stated our errand. We were shown into the governor's private office, and I saw Mr. Cleveland for the first time. We three stood chatting together. I was born lazy, and I comforted myself by turning the corner of a table into a sort of seat. Presently the governor said, "Mr. Clemens, I was a fellow citizen of yours in Buffalo a good many months, a good while ago, and during those months you burst suddenly into a mighty fame out of a previous long-continued and no doubt proper obscurity. But I was a nobody, and you wouldn't notice me nor anything to do with me. But now that I have become somebody, you have changed your style, and you come here to shake hands with me and be sociable. How do you explain this kind of conduct?" "Oh," I said, "it is very simple, Your Excellency. In Buffalo you were nothing but a sheriff. I was in society. I couldn't afford to associate with sheriffs. But you are a governor now, and you are on your way to the presidency. It is a great difference, and it makes you worth while." There appeared to be about 16 doors to that spacious room. From each door a young man now emerged, and the 16 lined up and moved forward and stood in front of the governor with an aspect of respectful expectancy in their attitude. No one spoke for a moment. Then the governor said, "You are dismissed, gentlemen. Your services are not required. Mr. Clemens is sitting on the bells." There was a cluster of 16 bell buttons on the corner of the table. My proportions at that end of me were just right to enable me to cover the whole of that nest, and that is how I came to hatch out those 16 clerks. In accordance with the suggestion made in Gilder's letter recently received, I have written the following note to ex-President Cleveland upon his 69th birthday. "Honored Sir, your patriotic virtues have won for you the homage of half the nation and the enmity of the other half. This places your character as a citizen upon a summit as high as Washington's. The verdict is unanimous and unassailable. The votes of both sides are necessary in cases like these, and the votes of the one side are quite as valuable as are the votes of the other. Where the votes are all in a man's favor, the verdict is against him. It is sand, and history will wash it away. But the verdict for you is rock, and will stand. S. L. Clemens. As of date March 18, 1906. In a diary which Mrs. Clemens kept for a little while, a great many years ago, I find various mentions of Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was a near neighbor of ours in Hartford, with no fences between. And in those days she made as much use of our grounds as of her own in pleasant weather. Her mind had decayed, and she was a pathetic figure. She wandered about all the day long in the care of a muscular Irishwoman. Among the colonists of our neighborhood the doors always stood open in pleasant weather. Mrs. Stowe entered them at her own free will, and as she was always softly slippered and generally full of animal spirits, she was able to deal in surprises, and she liked to do it. She would slip up behind a person who was deep in dreams and musings, and fetch a war whoop that would jump that person out of his clothes. And she had other moods. Sometimes we would hear gentle music in the drawing-room, and would find her there at the piano, singing ancient and melancholy songs, with infinitely touching effect. Her husband, old Professor Stowe, was a picturesque figure. He wore a broad slouch hat. He was a large man and solemn. His beard was white and thick, and hung far down on his breast. The first time our little Susie ever saw him she encountered him on the street near our house, and came flying wide-eyed to her mother and said, "Santa Claus has got loose," which reminds me of Reverend Charlie Stowe's little boy, a little boy of 7 years. I met Reverend Charlie crossing his mother's grounds one morning, and he told me this little tale. He had been out to Chicago to attend a convention of congressional clergymen, and had taken his little boy with him. During the trip he reminded the little chap every now and then that he must be on his very best behavior there in Chicago. He said, "We shall be the guests of a clergyman. There will be other guests, clergymen and their wives, and you must be careful to let those people see by your walk and conversation that you are of a godly household. Be very careful about this. The admonition bore fruit. At the first breakfast which they ate in the Chicago clergyman's house, he heard his little son say in the meekest and most reverent way to the lady opposite him, "Please, won't you, for Christ's sake, pass the butter?" Mark Twain. To be continued. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the North American Review, December 21, 1906, Chapters from My Autobiography by Mark Twain, Chapter 8. Dictated in 1906. In those early days, dueling suddenly became a fashion in the new territory of Nevada, and by 1864 everybody was anxious to have a chance in the new sport, mainly for the reason that he was not able to thoroughly respect himself so long as he had not killed or crippled somebody in a duel, or been killed or crippled in one himself. At that time I had been serving as city editor on Mr. Goodman's Virginia City Enterprise for a matter of 2 years. I was 29 years old. I was ambitious in several ways, but I had entirely escaped the seductions of that particular craze. I had had no desire to fight a duel. I had no intention of provoking one. I did not feel respectable, but I got a certain amount of satisfaction out of feeling safe. I was ashamed of myself. The rest of the staff were ashamed of me, but I got along well enough. I had always been accustomed to feeling ashamed of myself for one thing or another, so there was no novelty for me in the situation. I bore it very well. Plunkett was on the staff. R. M. Daggett was on the staff. These had tried to get into duels, but for the present had failed, and were waiting. Goodman was the only one of us who had done anything to shed credit upon the paper. The rival paper was the Virginia Union. Its editor for a little while was Tom Fitch, called the Silver-Tongued Orator of Wisconsin. That was where he came from. He tuned up his oratory in the editorial columns of the Union, and Mr. Goodman invited him out and modified him with a bullet. I remember the joy of the staff when Goodman's challenge was accepted by Fitch. We ran late that night and made much of Joe Goodman. He was only 24 years old. He lacked the wisdom which a person has at 29, and he was as glad of being it as I was that I wasn't. He chose Major Graves for his second. That name is not right, but it's close enough. I don't remember the Major's name. Graves came over to instruct Joe in the dueling art. He had been a major under Walker, the gray-eyed man of destiny, and had fought all through that remarkable man's filibustering campaign in Central America. That fact gauges the Major. To say that a man was a major under Walker, and came out of that struggle ennobled by Walker's praise, is to say that the Major was not merely a brave man, but that he was brave to the very utmost limit of that word. All of Walker's men were like that. I knew the Gillis family intimately. The father made the campaign under Walker, and with him one son. They were in the memorable Plaza fight, and stood it out to the last against overwhelming odds, as did also all of the Walker men. The son was killed at the father's side. The father received a bullet through the eye. The old man, for he was an old man at the time, wore spectacles, and the bullet and one of the glasses went into his skull and remained there. There were some other sons, Steve, George, and Jim, very young chaps, the merest lads, who wanted to be in the Walker expedition, for they had their father's dauntless spirit. But Walker wouldn't have them. He said it was a serious expedition, and no place for children. The Major was a majestic creature, with a most stately and dignified and impressive military bearing, and he was by nature and training courteous, polite, graceful, winning, and he had had that quality which I think I have encountered in only one other man, Bob Howland, a mysterious quality which resides in the eye, and when that eye is turned upon an individual or a squad in warning, that is enough. The man that has that eye doesn't need to go armed. He can move upon an armed desperado and quell him and take him prisoner without saying a single word. I saw Bob Howland do that once, a slender, good-natured, amiable, gentle, kindly little skeleton of man, with a sweet blue eye that would win your heart when it smiled upon you, or turn cold and freeze it, according to the nature of the occasion. The Major stood Joe up straight, stood Steve Gillis up 15 paces away, made Joe turn right side toward Steve, cock his Navy six-shooter, that prodigious weapon, and hold it straight down against his leg, told him that that was the correct position for the gun, that the position ordinarily in use at Virginia City, that is to say the gun straight up in the air, then brought slowly down to your man, was all wrong. At the word "one," you must raise the gun slowly and steadily to the place on the other man's body that you desire to convince. Then after the pause, 2, 3, fire, stop. At the word "stop" you may fire, but not earlier. You may give yourself as much time as you please after that word. Then when you fire, you may advance and go on firing at your leisure and pleasure, if you can get any pleasure out of it. And in the meantime the other man, if he has been properly instructed and is alive to his privileges, is advancing on you and firing, and it is always likely that more or less trouble will result. Naturally, when Joe's revolver had risen to a level, it was pointing at Steve's breast, but the Major said, "No, that is not wise. Take all the risks of getting murdered yourself, but don't run any risk of murdering the other man. If you survive a duel, you want to survive it in such a way that the memory of it will not linger along with you through the rest of your life and interfere with your sleep. Aim at your man's leg, not at the knee, not above the knee, for those are danger spots. Aim below the knee, cripple him, but leave the rest of him to his mother." By grace of these truly wise and excellent instructions, Joe tumbled Fitch down next morning with a bullet through his lower leg, which furnished him a permanent limp, and Joe lost nothing but a lock of hair, which he could spare better then than he could now. For when I saw him here in New York a year ago, his crop was gone, he had nothing much left but a fringe, with a dome rising above. About a year later I got my chance, but I was not hunting for it. Goodman went off to San Francisco for a week's holiday and left me to be chief editor. I had supposed that that was an easy berth, there being nothing to do but write one editorial per day, but I was disappointed in that superstition. I couldn't find anything to write an article about the first day. Then it occurred to me that inasmuch as it was the 22nd of April, 1864, the next morning would be the 300th anniversary of Shakespeare's birthday, and what better theme could I want than that? I got the cyclopedia and examined it, and found out who Shakespeare was and what he had done, and I borrowed all that and laid it before a community that couldn't have been better prepared for instruction about Shakespeare than if they had been prepared by art. There wasn't enough of what Shakespeare had done to make an editorial of necessary length, but I filled it out with what he hadn't done, which in many respects was more important and striking and readable than the handsomest things he had really accomplished. But next day I was in trouble again. There were no more Shakespeares to work up. There was nothing in past history, or in the world's future possibilities, to make an editorial out of, suitable to that community. So there was but one theme left. That theme was Mr. Laird, proprietor of the Virginia Union. His editor had gone off to San Francisco, too, and Laird was trying his hand at editing. I woke up Mr. Laird with some courtesies of the kind that were fashionable among newspaper editors in that region, and he came back at me the next day in a most vitriolic way. He was hurt by something I had said about him, some little thing, I don't remember what it was now, probably called him a horse thief, or one of those little phrases customarily used to describe another editor. They were no doubt just and accurate, but Laird was a very sensitive creature, and he didn't like it. So he expected a challenge from Mr. Laird, because according to the rules, according to the etiquette of dueling as reconstructed and reorganized and improved by the duelists of that region, whenever you said a thing about another person that he didn't like, it wasn't sufficient for him to talk back in the same offensive spirit. Etiquette required him to send a challenge. So we waited for a challenge. Waited all day. It didn't come. And as the day wore along, hour after hour, and no challenge came, the boys grew depressed. They lost heart. But I was cheerful. I felt better and better all the time. They couldn't understand it, but I could understand it. It was my make that enabled me to be cheerful when other people were despondent. So then it became necessary for us to waive etiquette and challenge Mr. Laird. When we reached that decision they began to cheer up, but I began to lose some of my animation. However, in enterprises of this kind you are in the hands of your friends. There is nothing for you to do but to abide by what they consider to be the best course. Daggett wrote a challenge for me, for Daggett had the language, the right language, the convincing language, and I lacked it. Daggett poured out a stream of unsavory epithets upon Mr. Laird, charged with a vigor and venom of strength calculated to persuade him, and Steve Gillis, my second, carried the challenge and came back to wait for the return. It didn't come. The boys were exasperated, but I kept my temper. Steve carried another challenge, hotter than the other, and we waited again. Nothing came of it. I began to feel quite comfortable. I began to take an interest in the challenges myself. I had not felt any before, but it seemed to me that I was accumulating a great and valuable reputation at no expense, and my delight in this grew and grew, as challenge after challenge was declined, until by midnight I was beginning to think that there was nothing in the world so much to be desired as a chance to fight a duel. So I hurried Daggett up, made him keep on sending challenge after challenge. Oh, well, I overdid it. Laird accepted. I might have known that that would happen. Laird was a man you couldn't depend on. The boys were jubilant beyond expression. They helped me make my will, which was another discomfort, and I already had enough. And then they took me home. I didn't sleep any, didn't want to sleep. I had plenty of things to think about, and less than 4 hours to do it in, because 5 o'clock was the hour appointed for the tragedy, and I should have to use up 1 hour, beginning at 4, in practicing with a revolver and finding out which end of it to level at the adversary. At 4 we went down into a little gorge about a mile from town, and borrowed a barn door for a mark, borrowed it of a man who was over in California on a visit, and we set the barn door up and stood a fence rail up against the middle of it to represent Mr. Laird. But the rail was no proper representative of him, for he was longer than a rail and thinner. Nothing would ever fetch him but a line shot, and then, as like as not, he would split the bullet, the worst material for dueling purposes that could be imagined. I began on the rail. I couldn't hit the rail. Then I tried the barn door, but I couldn't hit the barn door. There was nobody in danger except stragglers around on the flanks of that mark. I was thoroughly discouraged, and I didn't cheer up any when we presently heard pistol shots over in the next little ravine. I knew what that was. That was Laird's gang out practicing him. They would hear my shots, and of course they would come up over the ridge to see what kind of a record I was making, see what their chances were against me. Well, I hadn't any record, and I knew that if Laird came over that ridge and saw my barn door without a scratch on it, he would be as anxious to fight as I was, or as I had been at midnight before that disastrous acceptance came. Now, just at this moment, a little bird, no bigger than a sparrow, flew along by and lit on a sage bush about 30 yards away. Steve whipped out his revolver and shot its head off. Oh, he was a marksman, much better than I was. He ran down there to pick up the bird, and just then, sure enough, Mr. Laird and his people came over the ridge, and they joined us. And when Laird's second saw that bird, with its head shot off, he lost color. He faded, and you could see that he was interested. He said, "Who did that?" Before I could answer, Steve spoke up and said quite calmly and in a matter-of-fact way, "Clemens did it." The second said, "Why, that is wonderful. How far off was that bird?" Steve said, "Oh, not far, about 30 yards. The second said, "Well, that is astonishing shooting. How often can he do that?" Steve said languidly, "Oh, about 4 times out of 5. I knew the little rascal was lying, but I didn't say anything. The second said, "Why, that is amazing shooting. I supposed he couldn't hit a church." He was supposing very sagaciously, but I didn't say anything. Well, they said good morning. The second took Mr. Laird home, a little tottery on his legs, and Laird sent back a note in his own hand declining to fight a duel with me on any terms whatever. Well, my life was saved by that accident. I don't know what the bird thought about that interposition of Providence, but I felt very, very comfortable over it, satisfied and content. Now we found out later that Laird had hit his mark 4 times out of 6 right along. If the duel had come off, he would have so filled my skin with bullet holes that it wouldn't have held my principles. By breakfast time the news was all over town that I had sent a challenge, and Steve Gillis had carried it. Now that would entitle us to 2 years apiece in the penitentiary according to the brand-new law. Judge North sent us no message as coming from himself, but a message came from a close friend of his. He said it would be a good idea for us to leave the Territory by the first stagecoach. This would sail next morning at 4 o'clock, and in the meantime we would be searched for, but not with avidity. And if we were in the Territory after that stagecoach left, we would be the first victims of the new law. Judge North was anxious to have some object lessons for that law, and he would absolutely keep us in the prison the full 2 years. Well, it seemed to me that our society was no longer desirable in Nevada, so we stayed in our quarters and observed proper caution all day, except that once Steve went over to the hotel to attend to another customer of mine. That was a Mr. Cutler. You see, Laird was not the only person whom I had tried to reform during my occupancy of the editorial chair. I had looked around and selected several other people, and delivered a new zest of life into them through warm criticism and disapproval, so that when I laid down my editorial pen I had 4 horsewhippings and 2 duels owing to me. We didn't care for the horsewhippings. There was no glory in them. They were not worth the trouble of collecting. But honor required that some notice should be taken of that other duel. Mr. Cutler had come up from Carson City and had sent a man over with a challenge from the hotel. Steve went over to pacify him. Steve weighed only 95 pounds, but it was well known throughout the Territory that with his fists he could whip anybody that walked on 2 legs, let his weight and science be what they might. Steve was a Gillis, and when a Gillis confronted a man and had a proposition to make, the proposition always contained business. When Cutler found that Steve was my second, he cooled down. He became calm and rational, and was ready to listen. Steve gave him 15 minutes to get out of the hotel, and half an hour to get out of town, or there would be results. So that duel went off successfully, because Mr. Cutler immediately left for Carson, a convinced and reformed man. I have never had anything to do with duels since. I thoroughly disapprove of duels. I consider them unwise, and I know they are dangerous. Also sinful. If a man should challenge me now, I would go to that man and take him kindly and forgivingly by the hand, and lead him to a quiet, retired spot, and kill him. Mark Twain. To be continued. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the North American Review, January 4th, 1907, Chapters from My Autobiography, by Mark Twain, Chapter 9. Dictated December 13th, 1906. As regards the coming American monarchy, it was before the Secretary of State had been heard from that the chairman of the banquet said, "In this time of unrest it is of great satisfaction that such a man as you, Mr. Root, is chief adviser of the President." Mr. Root then got up and in the most quiet and orderly manner touched off the successor to the San Francisco earthquake. As a result, the several state governments were well shaken up and considerably weakened. Mr. Root was prophesying. He was prophesying, and it seems to me that no shrewder and surer forecasting had been done in this country for a good many years. He did not say in so many words that we are proceeding in a steady march towards eventual and unavoidable replacement of the republic by monarchy, but I suppose he was aware that that is the case. He notes the several steps, the customary steps, which in all the ages have led to the consolidation of loose and scattered governmental forces into formidable centralizations of authority. But he stops there and doesn't add up the sum. He is not unaware that heretofore the sum has been ultimate monarchy, and that the same figures can fairly be depended upon to furnish the same sum whenever and wherever they can be produced, so long as human nature shall remain as it is. But it was not needful that he do the adding, since any one can do it, neither would it have been gracious in him to do it. In observing the changed conditions, which in the course of time have made certain and sure the eventual seizure by the Washington government of a number of state duties and prerogatives which have been betrayed and neglected by the several states, he does not attribute those changes and the vast results which are to flow from them to any thought-out policy of any party or of any body of dreamers or schemers, but properly and rightly attributes them to that stupendous power, circumstance, which moves by laws of its own, regardless of parties and policies, and whose decrees are final, and must be obeyed by all, and will be. The railway is a circumstance, the steamship is a circumstance, the telegraph is a circumstance. They were mere happenings, and to the whole world, the wise and the foolish alike, they were entirely trivial, wholly inconsequential, indeed silly, comical, grotesque. No man and no party and no thought-out policy said, "Behold, we will build railways and steamships and telegraphs, and presently you will see the condition and way of life of every man and woman and child in the nation totally changed. Unimaginable changes of law and custom will follow, in spite of anything that anybody can do to prevent it." The changed conditions have come, and circumstance knows what is following, and will follow. So does Mr. Root. His language is not unclear, it is crystal. Our whole life has swung away from the old state centers and is crystallizing about national centers. The old barriers which kept the states as separate communities are completely lost from sight. That state power of regulation and control is gradually passing into the hands of the national government. Sometimes by an assertion of the interstate commerce power, sometimes by an assertion of the taxing power, the national government is taking up the performance of duties which under the changed conditions the separate states are no longer capable of adequately performing. We are urging forward in a development of business and social life which tends more and more to the obliteration of state lines and the decrease of state power as compared with national power. It is useless for the advocates of state rights to inveigh against the extension of national authority in the fields of necessary control where the states themselves fail in the performance of their duty. He is not announcing a policy, he is not forecasting what a party of planners will bring about, he is merely telling what the people will require and compel. And he could have added, which would be perfectly true, that the people will not be moved to it by speculation and cogitation and planning, but by circumstance, that power which arbitrarily compels all their actions, and over which they have not the slightest control. The end is not yet. It is a true word. We are on the march, but at present we are only just getting started. If the states continue to fail to do their duty as required by the people, constructions of the Constitution will be found to vest the power where it will be exercised, in the national government. I do not know whether that has a sinister meaning or not, and so I will not enlarge upon it lest I should chance to be in the wrong. It sounds like ship money come again, but it may not be so intended. Human nature being what it is, I suppose we must expect to drift into monarchy by and by. It is a saddening thought, but we cannot change our nature. We are all alike, we human beings, and in our blood and bone, and ineradicable, we carry the seeds out of which monarchies and aristocracies are grown. Worship of gods, titles, distinctions, power. We have to worship these things and their possessors. We are all born so, and we cannot help it. We have to be despised by somebody whom we regard as above us, or we are not happy. We have to have somebody to worship and envy, or we cannot be content. In America we manifest this in all the ancient and customary ways. In public we scoff at titles and hereditary privilege, but privately we hanker after them, and when we get a chance we buy them for cash and a daughter. Sometimes we get a good man and worth the price, but we are ready to take him anyway, whether he be ripe or rotten, whether he be clean and decent, or merely a basket of noble and sacred and long-descended offal. And when we get him, the whole nation publicly chafes and scoffs and privately envies, and also is proud of the honor which has been conferred upon us. We run over our list of titled purchases every now and then in the newspapers, and discuss them and caress them, and are thankful and happy. Like all the other nations, we worship money and the possessors of it, they being our aristocracy, and we have to have one. We like to read about rich people in the papers. The papers know it, and they do their best to keep this appetite liberally fed. They even leave out a football bullfight now and then to get room for all the particulars of how, according to the display heading, "Rich woman fell down cellar, not hurt." The falling down the cellar is of no interest to us when the woman is not rich, but no rich woman can fall down cellar and we not yearn to know all about it and wish it was us. In a monarchy the people willingly and rejoicingly revere and take pride in their nobilities, and are not humiliated by the reflection that this humble and hearty homage gets no return but contempt. Contempt does not shame them. They are used to it, and they recognize that it is their proper due. We are all made like that. In Europe we easily and quickly learn to take that attitude towards the sovereigns and the aristocracies. Moreover, it has been observed that when we get the attitude we go on and exaggerate it, presently becoming more servile than the natives, and vainer of it. The next step is to rail and scoff at republics and democracies, all of which is natural, for we have not ceased to be human beings by becoming Americans, and the human race was always intended to be governed by kingship, not by popular vote. I suppose we must expect that unavoidable and irresistible circumstances will gradually take away the powers of the states and concentrate them in the central government, and that the republic will then repeat the history of all time and become a monarchy. But I believe that if we obstruct these encroachments and steadily resist them, the monarchy can be postponed for a good while yet. Dictated December 1st, 1906. An exciting event in our village, Hannibal, was the arrival of the mesmerizer. I think the year was 1850. As to that I am not sure, but I know the month. It was May. That detail has survived the wear of 55 years. A pair of connected little incidents of that month have served to keep the memory of it green for me all this time. Incidents of no consequences and not worth embalming, yet my memory has preserved them carefully and flung away things of real value to give them space and make them comfortable. The truth is, a person's memory has no more sense than his conscience, and no appreciation whatever of values and proportions. However, never mind those trifling incidents. My subject is the mesmerizer now. He advertised his show and promised marvels. Admission, as usual, 25 cents, children and negroes, half price. The village had heard of mesmerism, in a general way, but had not encountered it yet. Not many people attended the first night, but next day they had so many wonders to tell that everybody's curiosity was fired, and after that for a fortnight the magician had prosperous times. I was 14 or 15 years old, the age at which a boy is willing to endure all things, suffer all things, short of death by fire, if thereby he may be conspicuous and show off before the public. And so, when I saw the subjects perform their foolish antics on the platform and make the people laugh and shout and admire, I had a burning desire to be a subject myself. Every night for 3 nights I sat in the row of candidates on the platform and held the magic disc in the palm of my hand and gazed at it and tried to get sleepy, but it was a failure. I remained wide awake and had to retire defeated like the majority. Also, I had to sit there and be gnawed with envy of Hicks, our journeyman. I had to sit there and see him scamper and jump when Simmons, the enchanter, exclaimed, "See the snake! See the snake!" and hear him say, "My, how beautiful!" in response to the suggestion that he was observing a splendid sunset, and so on the whole insane business. I couldn't laugh, I couldn't applaud. It filled me with bitterness to have others do it, and to have people make a hero of Hicks, and crowd around him when the show was over, and ask him for more and more particulars of the wonders he had seen in his visions, and manifest in many ways that they were proud to be acquainted with him. Hicks! The idea! I couldn't stand it. I was getting boiled to death in my own bile. On the 4th night temptation came, and I was not strong enough to resist. When I had gazed at the disc a while I pretended to be sleepy and began to nod. Straightway came the professor and made passes over my head and down my body and legs and arms, and finishing each pass with a snap of his fingers in the air to discharge the surplus electricity. Then he began to draw me with the disc, holding it in his fingers and telling me I could not take my eyes off it, try as I might. So I rose slowly, bent and gazing, and followed that disc all over the place, just as I had seen the others do. Then I was put through the other paces. Upon suggestion, I fled from snakes, passed buckets at a fire, became excited over hot steamboat races, made love to imaginary girls and kissed them, fished from the platform and landed mud cats that outweighed me, and so on, all customary marvels, but not in the customary way. I was cautious at first, and watchful, being afraid the professor would discover that I was an impostor and drive me from the platform in disgrace. But as soon as I realized that I was not in danger, I set myself the task of terminating Hicks's usefulness as a subject, and of usurping his place. It was a sufficiently easy task. Hicks was born honest. I without that encumbrance, so many people said. Hicks saw what he saw, and reported accordingly. I saw more than was visible, and added to it such details as could help. Hicks had no imagination. I had a double supply. He was born calm. I was born excited. No vision could start a rapture in him, and he was constipated as to language, anyway. But if I saw a vision, I emptied the dictionary onto it, and lost the remnant of my mind into the bargain. At the end of my first half-hour, Hicks was a thing of the past, a fallen hero, a broken idol, and I knew it, and was glad, and said in my heart, "Success to crime." Hicks could never have been mesmerized to the point where he could kiss an imaginary girl in public, or a real one either, but I was competent. Whatever Hicks had failed in, I made it a point to succeed in, let the cost be what it might, physically or morally. He had shown several bad defects, and I had made a note of them. For instance, if the magician asked, "What do you see?" and left him to invent a vision for himself, Hicks was dumb and blind, he couldn't see a thing, nor say a word, whereas the magician soon found that when it came to seeing visions of a stunning and marketable sort, I could get along better without his help than with it. Then there was another thing. Hicks wasn't worth a tallow dip on mute mental suggestion. Whenever Simmons stood behind him and gazed at the back of his skull and tried to drive a mental suggestion into it, Hicks sat with vacant face and never suspected. If he had been noticing, he could have seen by the rapt faces of the audience that something was going on behind his back that required a response. Inasmuch as I was an impostor, I dreaded to have this test put upon me, for I knew the professor would be willing me to do something, and as I couldn't know what it was, I should be exposed and denounced. However, when my time came, I took my chance. I perceived by the tense and expectant faces of the people that Simmons was behind me, willing me with all his might. I tried my best to imagine what he wanted, but nothing suggested itself. I felt ashamed and miserable then. I believed that the hour of my disgrace was come, and that in another moment I should go out of that place disgraced. I ought to be ashamed to confess it, but my next thought was, not how I could win the compassion of kindly hearts by going out humbly and in sorrow for my misdoings, but how I could go out most sensationally and spectacularly. There was a rusty and empty old revolver lying on the table among the properties employed in the performances. On May Day, 2 or 3 weeks before, there had been a celebration by the schools, and I had had a quarrel with a big boy who was the school bully, and I had not come out of it with credit. That boy was now seated in the middle of the house, halfway down the main aisle. I crept stealthily and impressively towards the table with a dark and murderous scowl on my face, copied from popular romance, seized the revolver suddenly, flourished it, shouted the bully's name, jumped off the platform, and made a rush for him and chased him out of the house before the paralyzed people could interfere to save him. There was a storm of applause, and the magician addressing the house said, most impressively, "That you may know how really remarkable this is, and how wonderfully developed a subject we have in this boy, I assure you that without a single spoken word to guide him, he has carried out what I mentally commanded him to do to the minutest detail. I could have stopped him at a moment in his vengeful career by a mere exertion of my will, therefore the poor fellow who has escaped was at no time in danger." So I was not in disgrace. I returned to the platform a hero, and happier than I have ever been in this world since. As regards mental suggestion, my fears of it were gone. I judged that in case I failed to guess what the professor might be willing me to do, I could count on putting up something that would answer just as well. I was right, and exhibitions of unspoken suggestion became a favorite with the public. Whenever I perceived that I was being willed to do something, I got up and did something, anything that occurred to me, and the magician, not being a fool, always ratified it. When people asked me, "How can you tell what he is willing you to do?" I said, "It's just as easy," and they always said admiringly, "Well, it beats me how you can do it." Hicks was weak in another detail. When the professor made passes over him and said, "His whole body is without sensation now, come forward and test him, ladies and gentlemen," The ladies and gentlemen always complied eagerly and stuck pins into Hicks, and if they went deep Hicks was sure to wince. Then that poor professor would have to explain that Hicks wasn't sufficiently under the influence. But I didn't wince. I only suffered and shed tears on the inside. The miseries that a conceited boy will endure to keep up his reputation. And so will a conceited man. I know it in my own person, and have seen it in 100,000 others. That professor ought to have protected me, and I often hoped he would, when the tests were unusually severe. But he didn't. It may be that he was deceived as well as the others, though I did not believe it, nor think it possible. Those were dear good people, but they must have carried simplicity and credulity to the limit. They would stick a pin in my arm and bear on it until they drove it a third of its length in, and then be lost in wonder that by a mere exercise of will-power the professor could turn my arm to iron and make it insensible to pain. Whereas it was not insensible at all. I was suffering agonies of pain. After that fourth night, that proud night, that triumphant night, I was the only subject. Simmons invited no more candidates to the platform. I performed alone every night the rest of the fortnight. In the beginning of the second week I conquered the last doubters. Up to that time a dozen wise old heads, the intellectual aristocracy of the town, had held out as implacable unbelievers. I was as hurt by this as if I were engaged in some honest occupation. There is nothing surprising about this. Human beings feel dishonor the most sometimes when they most deserve it. That handful of overwise old gentlemen kept on shaking their heads all the first week, and saying they had seen no marvels there that could not have been produced by collusion, and they were pretty vain of their unbelief, too, and liked to show it and air it, and be superior to the ignorant and the gullible. Particularly old Dr. Peake, who was the ringleader of the irreconcilables, and very formidable. For he was an FFV. He was learned, white-haired, and venerable, nobly and richly clad in the fashions of an earlier and courtlier day. He was large and stately, and he not only seemed wise, but was what he seemed in that regard. He had great influence, and his opinion upon any matter was worth much more than that of any other person in the community. When I conquered him at last, I knew I was undisputed master of the field. And now, after more than 50 years, I acknowledge, with a few dry old tears, that I rejoiced without shame. Dictated December 2nd, 1906. In 1847 we were living in a large white house on the corner of Hill and Main Streets, a house that still stands, and isn't large now, although it hasn't lost a plank. I saw it a year ago and noticed that shrinkage. My father died in it, March of the year mentioned, but our family did not move out of it until some months afterward. Ours was not the only family in the house. There was another, Dr. Grant's. One day Dr. Grant and Dr. Rayburn argued a matter on the street with sword canes, and Grant was brought home multifariously punctured. Old Dr. Peake caulked the leaks, and came every day for a while to look after him. The Grants were Virginians, like Peake, and one day, when Grant was getting well enough to be on his feet and sit around in the parlor and talk, the conversation fell upon Virginia and old times. I was present, but the group were probably quite unconscious of me, I being only a lad and a negligible quantity. Two of the group, Dr. Peake and Mrs. Crawford, Mrs. Grant's mother, had been of the audience when the Richmond Theater burned down, 36 years before, and they talked over the frightful details of that memorable tragedy. These were eyewitnesses, and with their eyes I saw it all with an intolerable vividness. I saw the black smoke rolling and tumbling toward the sky. I saw the flames burst through it and turn red. I heard the shrieks of the despairing. I glimpsed their faces at the windows, caught fitfully through the veiling smoke. I saw them jump to their death, or to mutilation worse than death. The picture is before me yet, and can never fade. In due course they talked of the colonial mansion of the Peakes, with its stately columns and its spacious grounds, and by odds and ends I picked up a clearly defined idea of the place. I was strongly interested, for I had not before heard of such palatial things from the lips of people who had seen them with their own eyes. One detail, casually dropped, hit my imagination hard. In the wall, by the great front door, there was a round hole as big as a saucer. A British cannon ball had made it in the War of the Revolution. It was breathtaking. It made history real. History had never been real to me before. Very well. 3 or 4 years later, as already mentioned, I was King Bee and sole subject in the Mesmeric show. It was the beginning of the second week, the performance was half over, and just then the majestic Dr. Peake, with his ruffled bosom and wristbands and his gold-headed cane, entered, and a deferential citizen vacated his seat beside the Grants and made the great chief take it. This happened while I was trying to invent something fresh in the way of a vision in response to the professor's remark. "Concentrate your powers. Look attentively. There. Don't you see something? Concentrate. Now then, describe it." Without suspecting it, Dr. Peake, by entering the place, had reminded me of the talk of 3 years ago. He had also furnished me capital, and was become my confederate, an accomplice in my frauds. I began on a vision, a vague and dim one, that was part of the game at the beginning of a vision. It isn't best to see it too clearly at first. It might look as if you had come loaded with it. The vision developed by degrees and gathered swing, momentum, energy. It was the Richmond fire. Dr. Peake was cold at first, and his fine face had a trace of polite scorn in it. But when he began to recognize that fire, that expression changed, and his eyes began to light up. As soon as I saw that, I threw the valves wide open and turned on all the steam, and gave those people a supper of fire and horrors that was calculated to last them one while. They couldn't gasp when I got through. They were petrified. Dr. Peake had risen and was standing and breathing hard. He said in a great voice, "My doubts are ended. No collusion could produce that miracle. It was totally impossible for him to know those details, yet he has described them with the clarity of an eyewitness, and with what unassailable truthfulness God knows I know." I saved the colonial mansion for the last night, and solidified and perpetuated Dr. Peake's conversion with a cannon-ball hole. He explained to the house that I could never have heard of that small detail which differentiated this mansion from all other Virginian mansions, and perfectly identified it. Therefore the fact stood proven that I had seen it in my vision. Lawks! It is curious. When the magician's engagement closed, there was but one person in the village who did not believe in mesmerism, and I was the one. All the others were converted, but I was to remain an implacable and unpersuadable disbeliever in mesmerism and hypnotism for close upon 50 years. This was because I never would examine them in after life. I couldn't. The subject revolted me, perhaps because it brought back to me a passage in my life which for pride's sake I wished to forget. Though I thought, or persuaded myself I thought, I should never come across a proof which wasn't thin and cheap, and probably had a fraud like me behind it. The truth is, I did not have to wait long to get tired of my triumphs. Not 30 days, I think. The glory which is built upon a lie soon becomes a most unpleasant encumbrance. No doubt for a while I enjoyed having my exploits told and retold and told again in my presence, and wondered over and exclaimed about, but I quite distinctly remember that there presently came a time when the subject was wearisome and odious to me, and I could not endure the disgusting discomfort of it. I am well aware that the world-glorified doer of a deed of great and real splendor has just my experience. I know that he deliciously enjoys hearing about it for 3 or 4 weeks, and that pretty soon after that he begins to dread the mention of it, and by wishes he had been with the damned before he ever thought of doing that deed. I remember how General Sherman used to rage and swear over "When we were marching through Georgia," which was played at him and sung at him everywhere he went. Still, I think I suffered a shade more than the legitimate hero does, he being privileged to soften his misery with the reflection that his glory was at any rate golden and reproachless in its origin, whereas I had no such privilege, there being no possible way to make mine respectable. How easy it is to make people believe a lie, and how hard it is to undo that work again. 35 years after those evil exploits of mine, I visited my old mother, whom I had not seen for 10 years, and being moved by what seemed to me a rather noble and perhaps heroic impulse, I thought I would humble myself and confess my ancient fault. It cost me a great effort to make up my mind. I dreaded the sorrow that would rise in her face, and the shame that would look out of her eyes, but after long and troubled reflection, The sacrifice seemed due and right, and I gathered my resolution together and made the confession. To my astonishment there were no sentimentalities, no dramatics, no George Washington effects. She was not moved in the least degree. She simply did not believe me, and said so. I was not merely disappointed, I was nettled. To have my costly truthfulness flung out of the market in this placid and confident way, when I was expecting to get a profit out of it. I asserted, and reasserted with rising heat, my statement that every single thing I had done on those long-vanished nights was a lie and a swindle. And when she shook her head tranquilly and said she knew better, I put up my hand and swore to it, adding a triumphant, "Now what do you say?" It did not affect her at all. It did not budge her the fraction of an inch from her position. If this was hard for me to endure, it did not begin with the blister she put upon the raw, when she began to put my sworn oath out of court with arguments to prove that I was under a delusion and did not know what I was talking about. Arguments! Arguments to show that a person on a man's outside can know better what is on his inside than he does himself. I had cherished some contempt for arguments before. I have not enlarged my respect for them since. She refused to believe that I had invented my visions myself. She said it was folly, that I was only a child at the time and could not have done it. She cited the Richmond fire and the Colonial Mansion and said they were quite beyond my capacities. Then I saw my chance. I said she was right. I didn't invent those. I got them from Dr. Peake. Even this great shot did no damage. She said Dr. Peake's evidence was better than mine, and he had said in plain words that it was impossible for me to have heard about those things. Dear, dear, what a grotesque and unthinkable situation. A confessed swindler convicted of honesty and condemned to acquittal by circumstantial evidence furnished by the swindled. I realized with shame and with impotent vexation that I was defeated all along the line. I had but one card left, but it was a formidable one. I played it and stood from under. It seemed ignoble to demolish her fortress after she had defended it so valiantly. But the defeated know not mercy. I played that master card. It was the pin-sticking. I said solemnly, "I give you my honor. A pin was never stuck into me without causing me cruel pain." She only said, "It is 35 years. I believe you do think that, now. But I was there, and I know better. You never winced." She was so calm, and I was so far from it, so nearly frantic. "Oh, my goodness," I said, "let me show you that I am speaking the truth. Here is my arm. Drive a pin into it. Drive it to the head. I shall not wince." She only shook her gray head and said, with simplicity and conviction, "You are a man now, and could dissemble the hurt, but you were only a child then, and could not have done it." And so the lie which I played upon her in my youth remained with her as an unchallengeable truth to the day of her death. Carlyle said, "A lie cannot live." It shows that he did not know how to tell them. If I had taken out a life policy on this one, the premiums would have bankrupted me ages ago. Mark Twain. To be continued. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the North American Review, January 18, 1907, Chapters from My Autobiography, Chapter 10, by Mark Twain. Dictated March 28, 1906. Orion Clemens was born in Jamestown, Fentress County, Tennessee, in 1825. He was the family's firstborn, and antedated me 10 years. Between him and me came a sister, Margaret, who died, aged 10, in 1837, in that village of Florida, Missouri, where I was born, and Pamela, mother of Samuel E. Moffett, who was an invalid all her life, and died in the neighborhood of New York a year ago, aged about 75. Her character was without blemish, and she was of a most kindly and gentle disposition. Also there was a brother, Benjamin, who died in 1843, aged 10 or 12. Orion's boyhood was spent in that wee little log hamlet of Jamestown, up there among the knobs, so-called, of East Tennessee. The family migrated to Florida, Missouri, then moved to Hannibal, Missouri, when Orion was 12 and a half years old. When he was 15 or 16, he was sent to St. Louis, and there he learned the printer's trade. One of his characteristics was eagerness. He woke with an eagerness about some matter or other every morning. It consumed him all day. It perished in the night, and he was on fire with a fresh, new interest next morning before he could get his clothes on. He exploited in this way 365 red-hot new eagernesses every year of his life. But I am forgetting another characteristic, a very pronounced one. That was his deep glooms, his despondencies, his despairs. These had their place in each and every day along with the eagerness. Thus his day was divided, no, not divided, mottled, from sunrise to midnight, with alternating brilliant sunshine and black cloud. Every day he was the most joyous and hopeful man that ever was, I think, and also every day he was the most miserable man that ever was. While he was in his apprenticeship in St. Louis, he got well acquainted with Edward Bates, who was afterwards in Mr. Lincoln's first cabinet. Bates was a very fine man, an honorable and upright man, and a distinguished lawyer. He patiently allowed Orion to bring to him each new project. He discussed it with him and extinguished it by argument and irresistible logic at first. But after a few weeks he found that this labor was not necessary, that he could leave the new project alone, and it would extinguish itself the same night. Orion thought he would like to become a lawyer. Mr. Bates encouraged him, and he studied law nearly a week, then of course laid it aside to try something new. He wanted to become an orator. Mr. Bates gave him lessons. Mr. Bates walked the floor reading from an English book aloud and rapidly turning the English into French, and he recommended this exercise to Orion. But as Orion knew no French, he took up that study and wrought at it like a volcano for 2 or 3 days, then gave it up. During his apprenticeship in St. Louis, he joined a number of churches, one after another, and taught in their Sunday schools, changing his Sunday school every time he changed his religion. He was correspondingly erratic in his politics, Whig today, Democrat next week, and anything fresh that he could find in the political market the week after. I may remark here that throughout his long life he was always trading religions and enjoying the change of scenery. I will also remark that his sincerity was never doubted, his truthfulness was never doubted, and in matters of business and money his honesty was never questioned. Notwithstanding his forever recurring caprices and changes, his principles were high, always high, and absolutely unshakable. He was the strangest compound that ever got mixed in a human mold. Such a person as that is given to acting upon impulse and without reflection. That was Orion's way. Everything he did with conviction and enthusiasm, and with a vainglorious pride in the thing he was doing, and no matter what that thing was, whether good, bad, or indifferent, he repented of it every time in sackcloth and ashes before 24 hours had sped. Pessimists are born, not made. Optimists are born, not made. But I think he was the only person I have ever known in whom pessimism and optimism were lodged in exactly equal proportions. Except in the matter of grounded principle, he was as unstable as water. You could dash his spirits with a single word, you could raise them into the sky again with another one. You could break his heart with a word of disapproval, you could make him as happy as an angel with a word of approval. And there was no occasion to put any sense or any vestige of mentality of any kind into these miracles. Anything you might say would answer. He had another conspicuous characteristic, and it was the father of those which I have just spoken of. This was an intense lust for approval. He was so eager to be approved, so girlishly anxious to be approved by anybody and everybody, without discrimination, that he was commonly ready to forsake his notions, opinions, and convictions at a moment's notice in order to get the approval of any person who disagreed with them. I wish to be understood as reserving his fundamental principles all the time. He never forsook those to please anybody. Born and reared among slaves and slaveholders, he was yet an abolitionist from his boyhood to his death. He was always truthful, he was always sincere, he was always honest and honorable. But in light matters, matters of small consequence, like religion and politics and such things, he never acquired a conviction that could survive a disappointing remark from a cat. He was always dreaming. He was a dreamer from birth, and this characteristic got him into trouble now and then. Once, when he was 23 or 24 years old and was become a journeyman, he conceived the romantic idea of coming to Hannibal without giving us notice, in order that he might furnish to the family a pleasant surprise. If he had given notice, he would have been informed that we had changed our residence, and that gruff old bass-voiced sailor-man, Dr. G., our family physician, was living in the house which we had formerly occupied, and that Orion's former room in that house was now occupied by Dr. G.'s two middle-aged maiden sisters. Orion arrived at Hannibal per steamship in the middle of the night, and started with his customary eagerness on his excursion, his mind all on fire with his romantic project, and building and enjoying his surprise in advance. He was always enjoying things in advance. It was the make of him. He never could wait for the event, but must build it out of dream stuff and enjoy it beforehand. Consequently, sometimes when the event happened, he saw that it was not as good as the one he had invented in his imagination, and so he had lost profit by not keeping the imaginary one and letting the reality go. When he arrived at the house, he went around to the back door and slipped off his boots and crept upstairs and arrived at the room of those elderly ladies without having awakened any sleepers. He undressed in the dark and got into bed and snuggled up against somebody. He was a little surprised, but not much, for he thought it was our brother Ben. It was winter, and the bed was comfortable, and the supposed bed added to the comfort, and so he was dropping off to sleep very well satisfied with his progress so far, and full of happy dreams of what was going to happen in the morning. But something else was going to happen sooner than that, and it happened now. The maid that was being crowded fumed and fretted and struggled, and presently came to a half-waking condition and protested against the crowding. That voice paralyzed Orion. He couldn't move a limb. He couldn't get his breath. And the crowded one discovered his new whiskers and began to scream. This removed the paralysis, and Orion was out of the bed and clawing round in the dark for his clothes in a fraction of a second. Both maids began to scream then, so Orion did not wait to get his whole wardrobe. He started with such parts of it as he could grab. He flew to the head of the stairs and started down, and was paralyzed again at that point because he saw the faint yellow flame of a candle soaring up the stairs from below, and he judged that Dr. G. was behind it, and he was. He had no clothes on to speak of, but no matter, he was well enough fixed for an occasion like this, because he had a butcher knife in his hand. Orion shouted to him, and this saved his life, for the doctor recognized his voice. Then, in those deep sea-going bass tones of his that I used to admire so much when I was a little boy, he explained to Orion the change that had been made, told him where to find the Clemens family, and closed with some quite unnecessary advice about posting himself before he undertook another adventure like that, advice which Orion probably never needed again as long as he lived. One bitter December night, Orion sat up reading until 3 o'clock in the morning, and then, without looking at a clock, sallied forth to call on a young lady. He hammered and hammered at the door, couldn't get any response, didn't understand it. Anybody else would have regarded that as an indication of some kind or other, and would have drawn inferences and gone home. But Orion didn't draw inferences. He merely hammered, and finally the father of the girl appeared at the door in a dressing-gown. He had a candle in his hand, and the dressing-gown was all the clothing he had on, except an expression of unwelcome, which was so thick and so large that it extended all down his front to his instep, and nearly obliterated the dressing-gown. But Orion didn't notice that this was an unpleasant expression. He merely walked in. The old gentleman took him into the parlor, set the candle on a table, and stood. Orion made the usual remarks about the weather, and sat down and talked, and went on talking, that old man looking at him vindictively and waiting for his chance, waiting treacherously and malignantly for his chance. Orion had not asked for the young lady. It was not customary. It was understood that a young fellow came to see the girl of the house, not the founder of it. At last Orion got up and made some remark to the effect that probably the young lady was busy, and he would go now and call again. That was the old man's chance, and he said with fervency, "Why, good land, aren't you going to stop for breakfast?" Orion did not come to Hannibal until 2 or 3 years after my father's death. Meantime he remained in St. Louis. He was a journeyman printer and earning wages. Out of his wage he supported my mother and my brother Henry, who was 2 years younger than I. My sister Pamela helped in this support by taking piano pupils. Thus we got along, but it was pretty hard sledding. I was not one of the burdens, because I was taken from school at once upon my father's death and placed in the office of the Hannibal Courier as printer's apprentice, and Mr. S., the editor and proprietor of the paper, allowed me the usual emolument of the office of apprentice, that is to say, board and clothes, but no money. The clothes consisted of 2 suits a year, but one of the suits always failed to materialize, and the other suit was not purchased so long as Mr. S.'s old clothes held out. I was only about half as big as Mr. S., consequently his shirts gave me the uncomfortable sense of living in a circus tent, and I had to turn up his pants to my ears to make them short enough. There were 2 other apprentices. One was Steve Wilkins, 17 or 18 years old, and a giant. When he was in Mr. S.'s clothes they fitted him as the candle mold fits the candle. Thus he was generally in a suffocated condition, particularly in the summer-time. He was a reckless, hilarious, admirable creature. He had no principles, and was delightful company. At first we 3 apprentices had to feed in the kitchen with the old slave cook and her very handsome and bright and well-behaved young mulatto daughter. For his own amusement, for he was not generally laboring for other people's amusement, Steve was constantly and persistently and loudly and elaborately making love to that mulatto girl and distressing the life out of her, and worrying the old mother to death. She would say, "Now, Marse Steve, can't you behave yourself?" With encouragement like that, Steve would naturally renew his attentions and emphasize them. It was killingly funny to Ralph and me. And, to speak truly, the old mother's distress about it was merely a pretense. She quite well understood that by the customs of slaveholding communities it was Steve's right to make love to that girl if he wanted to. But the girl's distress was very real. She had a refined nature, and she took all Steve's extravagant love-making in resentful earnest. We got but little variety in the way of food at that kitchen table, and there wasn't enough of it anyway, so we apprentices used to keep alive by arts of our own. That is to say, we crept into the cellar nearly every night by a private entrance which we had discovered, and we robbed the cellar of potatoes and onions and such things, and carried them downtown to the printing office, where we slept on pallets on the floor, and cooked them at the store, and had very good times. As I have indicated, Mr. S.'s economies were of a pretty close and rigid kind. By and by, when we apprentices were promoted from the basement to the ground floor and allowed to sit at the family table, along with the one journeyman, Harry H., the economies continued. Mrs. S. was a bride. She had attained to that distinction very recently, after waiting a good part of a lifetime for it, and she was the right woman in the right place according to the economies of the place, for she did not trust the sugar bowl to us, but sweetened our coffee herself. That is, she went through the motions. She didn't really sweeten it. She seemed to put 1 heaping teaspoonful of brown sugar into each cup, but according to Steve that was a deceit. He said she dipped the spoon in the coffee first to make the sugar stick, and then scooped the sugar out of the bowl with the spoon upside down, so that the effect to the eye was a heaped-up spoon, whereas the sugar on it was nothing but a layer. This all seems perfectly true to me, and yet that thing would be so difficult to perform that I suppose it really didn't happen, but was one of Steve's lies. Mark Twain. To be continued.